I'm Terry Coleth. I'm here today with Professor Adrian Kehr. We've gotten to session 3 of our History of the United States to 1815, and we are starting in 1776, Professor Kehr.
Hello, Terry.
Hello.
Hi. We explored how the colonists expanded and the numbers of people coming into the New World grew and grew and came into contact with the French last term, and how they were driven out. And then the issue was who was to pay for the successful war. And anybody who's asked to pay for a foreign war doesn't do so willingly. Of course, the Brits themselves, they were taxed more than the colonists. And so it wasn't an unfair tax. It was the concept of the people in the colonies did not have any representation. And we heard the expression, of course, no taxation without representation. And you can think that in Canada, which was given representation, stayed in the British Empire and the Commonwealth. So there's an example of had more enlightened leadership in England allowed to have some form of representation, either in London, the Parliament, or have their own Parliament in America, doesn't really matter, would they still have been this energy to split off from England. So the taxation became an issue, and also the presence of English troops in the early colonies, because they were, remember, the French were still active, the Indians were still active, and a lot of farmers were open to attack by the American Indians. So there were redcoats in all the big cities, and redcoats drink too much and they cause trouble. The big issue, of course, in Boston, I would focus on Boston particularly, was that was the hotbed of smuggling. John Hancock, who we know famously from the Declaration signing, he was the most famous and successful of smugglers. In Boston, he had a fleet of ships, and they brought in goods which would have incurred an import duty. All countries have import duty, whether Britain or America has import duties today. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with import duties. It's just a matter of, do we have to pay them? And so we had in Boston a situation where the redcoats were trying to use spies to tell them who was smuggling when, and then they would actually pick up those ships coming through at night. So they'd be bringing in rum, they were bringing in tea, coffee, any foreign goods which would have been taxed were being run through the smugglers, and John Hancock was the biggest of these. Anybody who gave information to the British authorities, taxation-wise, would be rewarded by the Brits, of course, were tarred and feathered and given a bad time in Boston. And so it was that the people who didn't believe they should have to live with redcoats in Boston and have to pay import duty led to a scuffle in Boston itself, which is overstated as being the Boston Massacre, where some redcoats were under pressure from a mob, and they fired at the mob and people died. John Adams was tremendous, and he was a country lawyer, and he came into the town and said, somebody has to protect these redcoats. You can't just simply assume that they're guilty. And he protected them. Only one, the leader, actually was found guilty of a crime, and he was branded. So there's John Adams early on wanting fair play. But from that time onwards, it became a series of irritating confrontations between the British government, who was ever increasing taxation, and the colonies who didn't want to pay tax. And of course, the famous Stamp Act was another hot point where people think of the postage stamps. No, this was a stamp where you conduct government business, buying land, selling property, etc. It had to be stamped, and you pay for that. And today you do. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the Stamp Act. I mean, today, when you buy a house, you have to pay stamp duty. Sure. So it was just the concept of a foreign power, we have no say in this. And all of this grew to a point where eventually the Boston Tea Party took place, I will tell you the true story behind the Boston Tea Party, which is not what you were taught in high school. And then, of course, the belief that there was no real way to have an agreement with George, King George, led the Patriots to actually mobilize and develop weapon stores, which led to the famous Lexington and Concord event, where the Redcoats went out to capture these weapons and stop them being used. And that was the precursor to the Bunker Hill attack, where the Patriots decided they could lob shells into Boston, and Boston was undefendable, so the British pulled out of Boston, and that was the famous Battle of Bunker Hill. And so when the Boston Tea Party took place, the British government said, you've destroyed all this tea, which has a certain value, you can't do that, we're going to shut down the port. And that's the beginning of the two sides forming up. And of course they have the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and they decide what is to be done. And they decide to go for full independence, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. And then the two sides line up. This is the colonies and the enormous British Empire. Who's going to win?
It must have seemed almost impossible to win.
If you're a betting person in the world at that time, the colonists had no chance. But remember George Washington, who was appointed commander-in-chief, because he was the only one with any military experience. He said, I don't have to beat the British. I just have to keep alive and make sure the army is kept intact. That's all I have. The British, the Redcoats, have to defeat the army and capture me. So he doesn't have to win the war. He just makes sure he doesn't lose the war.
Interesting, interesting. All right, I hope you join us for this section, which will take us right up to the time that the sides match up.